Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia and this is my wrap-up for June and July. That's right, I forgot to do a wrap-up in June, and since I read quite a few books in June but not so many books in July, I thought I'd put them both together and talk about all of the books that I've read over the past 2 months in this video. Now, even though I didn't read as many books in July as I wanted, that's still quite a lot of books, so this video is going to be a little bit longer than usual. I recommend that if you're interested in just a particular part of this wrap-up, if you're interested just in one or two of the books that I'm discussing, check the description box. I will post timestamps to specific books in the description box, so you can go ahead and jump to whichever part of this wrap-up you're interested in. But otherwise, let's get straight into the wrap-up. As usual, I will shout out 3 small booktubers that I've been particularly enjoying over the past month, or in this case, over the past 2 months. And I usually pick booktubers with under 500 subscribers, but my first shout-out is actually going to someone who has just over 500 subscribers, but didn't when I first came across her channel back in June. And that is Tia and All the Books. Her channel, as well as the other 2 channels that I'm shouting out, will be linked in the description box as well. What I like about Tia's channel is the variety of books that she reads and the variety of different types of videos that she does. So her genres span from thrillers to romance to general fiction, literary fiction, classics, really wide variety of books, definitely more broad than what I usually read. And she also takes part in a lot of readathons, which is fun because I get to enjoy the kind of readathons, read-alongs and other reading events that I don't participate in through her videos. So yeah, if you're after a booktuber who reads a wide variety of books and makes a wide variety of videos, check out Tia from Tia and All the Books. The second channel I want to recommend is a brand new channel. I think it's only a few weeks old, and it is Taking Tea with Catherine. And as the title suggests, Catherine drinks tea while talking about books. So she's really into her tea. She drinks different types of tea. She talks about what tea she's drinking in each video. It seems like she lives somewhere where it's quite hot at the moment, so I don't know how she's managing to drink hot tea while sitting in the summer heat, but I guess she really likes tea. She took part in Jane Austen July, and that's how I came across her videos. She has a really casual, chatty, quite funny way of talking about books that I really enjoy. So because it's a new channel, there isn't a huge amount of backlog, but definitely go check her out, and I can't wait to see which direction her channel is going to take next. And the last shout out goes to Rainy Day Reads, who does really lovely vlogs. The vlogs are really what I enjoy about her channel. Her vlogs combine the life bit and the reading bit in a really organic and fun way. And I just love hearing her talk about books. I think her reading tastes are very similar to mine. And we seem to enjoy the same kinds of books. She's a bit more into the highbrow classics, I know, because she's an actress and she's been acting in a Shakespeare play lately as well. So she talks a bit about that. Just really interesting channel, really lovely booktuber, and some fantastic vlog content on Rainy Day Reads. Go check all 3 of them out. Their channels are linked in the description box, and tell them I sent you. So let's get into the wrap-up. By the way, I realised that the light is kind of being a bit crazy. I'm recording this in the morning before I go to work, so unfortunately I can't wait for the sun to stop being a dick and, you know, just be consistent. But that's what happens when you film in natural light. Anyway, in June and July I read 8 books altogether with an average rating of 3.5 stars. Let's get straight into it. The first book I finished was Grey Sister by Mark Lawrence, and I read this on my Kindle. This is the sequel to the book Red Sister, which I read last year, I think. And it's the second book in the series called The Book of the Ancestor. And this is really not my usual genre. This is a fantasy book which follows a teenage novice in a nun's convent, but because this is a fantasy book, it's not your average nun's convent. Obviously there's magic involved, there's fighting involved, there's assassins and all sorts of cool fantasy things. The world is a really interesting one in which the poles have frozen over so much that basically, if you imagine the globe, everything's frozen up from the north, everything's frozen up from the south, and the only bit of Earth, or the bit of planet remaining, is a thin corridor around the equator, and that's basically the whole world. So it's a very narrowing world. It's people are running out of resources and running out of space as the ice poles come closer and closer together. And the main character, Nonna, grew up in quite a poor circumstances, but then was basically adopted into this nun's convent where she grows up. All of that happens in the first book. In the second book, we develop her story a bit more, and she gets into all sorts of adventures. I really don't want to spoiler this book because you should read the first one before getting to the second one. It's got everything that you would expect from this kind of book. It's got magic, a lot of fighting, some cool things like mind reading, and a really fantastic setting. What this book was lacking that I enjoyed so much in Red Sister, the first book, is a slow pace and some really good character development. So this book was a lot more fast-paced, a lot more action-packed, had a lot more fighting and violence, which is not something that I enjoy reading about a lot. I find myself getting a bit bored with fight sequences generally. So therefore this book gets a little bit of a lower rating than the first one. I only gave this one 3 stars, but I still very much enjoy reading this series, and I will definitely pick up the next book, which is called Holy Sister. I would recommend the Book of the Ancestors series if basically what I just told you sounds interesting to you. If you're interested in a fantasy world and a kind of assassin nun convent and everything that goes along with it. The second book I finished was The Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler, and this is one of those dystopian classics that I always meant to read. It's from 1993, but it's set in 2025, and I listened to the audiobook. And this follows a teenager named Lauren who grows up in a suburban walled community in California in a time of violence, climate change, political uncertainty and rising poverty, and that is a combination of circumstances that makes for a really hostile environment for Lauren and her family. She is one of the lucky ones because she lives in this, basically in this cul-de-sac that's walled off and armed by the residents. So her entire world is made up of these dozen or so families that live in that one street. But then something happens and she has to make a journey across this dangerous and hostile world. While all of this is going on, she thinks about spirituality and religion, and she kind of founds her own religion first in her head, but then she starts talking about it. So really you can sort of, it's almost like the beginning of a cult or the beginning of a religion through the eyes of its founder. This is a diary novel, so we get to see everything from Lauren's perspective as she writes it in her diary. And the writing is what made this so damn good. This is one of the best dystopian novels I've ever read. I straight up gave it 5 stars. Was blown away by this book, and especially how it combines a very realistic dystopian scenario with a really charismatic and just pretty amazing main character who you don't really identify with because she's just so out there. She's very, very unique, navigating a really dangerous world that is not that far from our own. So, great novel. Highly recommend if you enjoy dystopian fiction. And I can't wait to explore more of Octavia E. Butler's writing. This is the first one of her books that I ever read. I know that there is actually a sequel to The Parable of the Sower, so I will definitely pick that one up at some point. Maybe get the audiobook as well, because actually a diary novel works really well as an audiobook because it lends a voice to the main character, because it is so much written in her voice that if you have someone read it out to you, you can just picture the world and the characters in it a bit more vividly, I find. The next book I read, and actually the first one in this wrap-up that I read in physical form, was Der Vorleser by Bernhard Schlink. I've got this one here. And this is translated into English as The Reader, and there was a film about it, so I'm sure you've at least heard of this title. This is from 1995, but it's set back in post-war Berlin. It begins as a story of a 15-year-old boy who gets sexually involved with, is taken advantage of by a woman in her 30s. But then she suddenly disappears, and the next time he sees her, it's in the context of a courtroom where she is on trial for crimes that she committed in the past. It's a very short book, and it didn't take me long to read at all. I have to say that I enjoyed the second half much more, the courtroom part of this. First of all, because reading the whole kind of paedophilia part of the story I found very uncomfortable, but at the same time it's not really discussed as such, so the fact that he is so young, it doesn't really matter for the story, so I just found it a bit odd. But I did enjoy the discussion of war crimes and the discussion of how to deal with the past. That was a really big thing in German history of the mid and late 20th century. Generally though, I didn't really connect with the main character, and the style wasn't really for me, so even though it was an interesting read, I gave it 3 stars because I did make it through and I did enjoy most of it, but it's definitely, I don't know, it was just a bit meh. Like, I don't even have enough opinion on this to talk to you about the book. Would I recommend it? I don't know, like, if you're interested in the story from what I've told you, then go ahead and read it. It'll only take you a day or two, but it just didn't do it for me. Next up, I read Where Angels Fear to Tread by E.M. Forster, and this is the 5th E.M. Forster I read. There's only one book left, which is A Passage to India, and then I'm done with his novels, which is making me very sad already. This is from 1905. It's one of his lesser known novels, and it is really the story of a scandal. It's about a young widow in her 30s called Lilia, who runs off with a much younger Italian man while on holiday in Tuscany. And this is such typical E.M. Forster. It's, I mean, almost peak E.M. Forster. It's got all of the things that I love about his novels. It's got some unconventional relationships. It's got some critique and ridicule of the English middle classes. It talks about the transformative effect of travelling, but then also makes fun of the transformative effect of travelling. It's got cultures clashing, both the Italian clashing with the English, but also different classes clashing, different types of people clashing. And Lilia, the main character, is very much breaking free of her old life here, which was controlled by her dead husband's family, especially his mother-in-law. And his mother-in-law always considered Lilia to be beneath her socially and, you know, as a person. So then there is this surprise marriage to this Italian named Gino, and everyone's going mad. If you've read any other E.M. Forster and enjoyed it, then you will enjoy this one too. I found that this is the funniest E.M. Forster book that I've read. Maybe it's just because I'm so familiar with the Italian village archetypes and stereotypes that are kind of being made fun of here. Even though the village of Monteriano in Tuscany is a fictional village, it's clearly based on some real places. And even though my own family from Italy lives much further in the south, just this setting of the Italian mountain village was so familiar to me that I found that, first of all, very fascinating to read about, but also absolutely hilarious. Just the way that E.M. Forster makes fun of these Italian archetypes. In the same way he makes fun of the English archetypes. So yeah, it is a study of two cultures, really. I gave this book 4 stars. I found it as delightful as I found every E.M. Forster book so far. Next up, bit of a weird one for me. I read Stephen King's On Writing, a Memoir of the Craft. And I picked this one up because my PhD supervisor recommended it to me. He said that it would give me some advice about how to write in an academic setting, which it didn't. let's just say straight away, as a PhD manual, this is absolutely useless. Yeah, it's mostly a memoir. I mean, it says a memoir of the craft, so it is mostly Stephen King's memoir with a little bit of writing advice here and there, but it was still very interesting, considering that I have no connection to Stephen King whatsoever, that I don't know any of the books that he's referencing in this, that I have no interest in his life. Considering all of that, this was a really good read. His style, even in the non-fiction way, is very engaging and very easy to read through. And yeah, this could be the life story of anyone, but it's so well written that I did quite enjoy it. And I gave it 3 stars, which for me, for a non-fiction book, for a memoir, which is not one of my favourite genres, for a memoir of an author whom I have no interest in, is pretty good. So then I read a thriller, and I read The Beautiful Dead by Belinda Bauer. This is a recommendation from guest spinster Robin. She also lent me the book, and it's a crime thriller that follows a crime news reporter in London as she covers a series of horrific murders for her TV station. And then we also get chapters from the killer's perspective, who tries to use her, the crime reporter whose name is Eve, to publicize his crimes. And this is a fairly standard kind of crime thriller. So you got like the psychopathic serial killer, you got the unwilling detective who just gets thrown into the story. As far as that goes, like I said, pretty standard, but I did really enjoy the character moments between the reporter Eve and her father, because she is caring for her father who has early onset dementia, and I found their dynamic and their relationship really interesting to read about. And there is a lot more about this relationship in the second half of the book, which is why I found the second half much more engaging as well. I gave this book 3 stars. If you know me, you know that I love slow, character-focused novels, and I find it difficult to be interested in a fast-paced, action-packed, plot-driven book. So this book for me kind of combined the two quite nicely. Then I read my first and only entry for Jane Austen July, which is Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. And I read that both as a paper book and also listened to the audiobook read by Rosamund Pike, which was really good. It's really good to mix those two up. And this was a reread. I'd already read that before some years ago, and I enjoyed it a lot more on my second read. This is a novel that follows 2 sisters, Eleanor and Marianne. Eleanor is the sense, Marianne is the sensibility. So Eleanor is very rational, doesn't really talk about herself, doesn't really express her emotions. Marianne is the opposite. She's very wild and feels everything passionately and expresses her emotions to everyone. So they're opposites that navigate a life in a small cottage where they have to live because of their family's sudden poverty. Obviously, this is poverty in a Jane Austen sense, so they still have a servant or 2, but they just don't live in a big manor house. Sense and Sensibility was much better than I remembered. I'd always thought of this book as Jane Austen's least developed, least detailed. But actually it's not. The storytelling is quite masterful in this. The characters are really well fleshed out and the plot is well crafted. So I surprised myself positively with this book, and I actually bumped up my rating from 3 to 4 stars. It's still not going to be one of my favourite Jane Austen novels, and that's actually because I don't think the romantic relationships work very well in this. I don't want to spoil the book if you've not read it, but I don't think the couples that end up together should necessarily be together. Let's put it like that. Let's move on to the last book that I read in July. Actually, I read this one throughout June and July, and it is Ken Follett's The Pillars of the Earth. And this was a buddy read with Andrea from Infinite Text, and also a read-along that a lot of people took part in on Goodreads. This is from 1989, and all I knew when I started reading this book was that it is about the building of a cathedral. But actually, it's a very long historical epic story spanning the decades between the death of King Henry I in 1935, in 1135, and the death of Thomas Becket in 1170. So it spans 35 years and follows different characters throughout those 35 years, with chapters and sections switching perspective between the different characters. There is, for example, Tom, who is a mason whose life dream is to build a cathedral. There is Philip, who's the prior of a monastery who needs a cathedral built. There's Ellen, she's an outlaw at the beginning of the story who lives with her son in the woods. Aliena, the daughter of a disgraced earl who took the wrong side in the civil war that ensued from King Henry's death. There's William, who's an ambitious young lord who wants to be an earl. There's Waleran, who's an ambitious young bishop who wants to be archbishop. So there's different characters and they all take part in this story and we get to see their perspective throughout the book. And the story itself is pretty amazing. Like, I can only imagine the chart that Ken Follett had preparing this intricate plot. And I love that we learn so much about life in the 12th century. This is what fascinates me about historical fiction the most, the learning about how people lived back then, even down to the food. I'm massively interested in food history anyway, down to sleeping arrangements, architecture, social connections, travel, currency, trade. There's a lot of things that you learn about the 12th century just from reading this big old novel. But the characters were the big disappointment for me. As I've just said, I really love good character, deep characters that feel like humans. But the characters in The Pillars of the Earth are too black and white. They're either good or evil. For example, William, he's evil. Therefore, he likes raping, murdering, stealing, burning things down. Jack, another character, he's good. And you know that because he likes foreign languages, stories, maths, and he's not horrible to women. So yeah, every character in the book falls into the either good or evil category. And it's just a very simplistic way of looking at people, isn't it? We want our book characters to be three-dimensional, to be flawed, and to be human. Because even a villain in a story has a motivation that goes beyond being a villain. And I just don't think the motivations in The Pillars of the Earth made a whole lot of sense to me. The other thing that I didn't like about this book was Ken Follett's descriptions of women. He is just not great at writing female characters. First of all, the only really developed female character is Aliena. The only one out of the many characters in this book. It's not like there aren't other women, but they are even flatter than what I've just described. Speaking of flat, Ken Follett is absolutely obsessed with breasts. Out of the 1,000 pages of this book, at least 20 are concerned purely with the description of breasts. And boobs are described in that very male novelist kind of way, you know, using words like perky and full and supple. Yeah. Kind of off-putting, really. The other thing that Ken Follett doesn't have a great grip on is female sexuality and how female sexuality works. Yeah, so that dampened my enjoyment of the book a little bit. And the other thing, on a more serious note, is the way that he uses violence, but in particular sexual violence and violence against women, as a plot device really didn't sit right with me. So that is really the one serious warning I want to give you. If you are interested in this book, just be aware of that. Now, I did enjoy The Pillars of the Earth overall, but I did enjoy it by focusing on those amazing aspects of world building, of storytelling. The style was quite easy to read as well. It wasn't a difficult book to get through, and I loved being immersed in this medieval setting for 2 whole months. But the whole way that Ken Follett deals with women just was a little bit off-putting and reminded me why I, generally speaking, prefer books written by women. 3 stars overall though. Would recommend if you're interested in this story and in this setting and in historical fiction in general, because you can't deny it's a classic of the genre. So that was the 8 books that I read in June and July. This has been a very long video. It's going to take me a long time to edit, I'm sure. So I'm going to just finish it here. I am participating in Classics-a-thon in August, so I hope I'll read some more classics. I guess I'll see you then. Enjoy your reading. Tell me what you thought of any of the books that I've spoken about, especially if you took part in the read-alongs for Sense and Sensibility or for Pillars of the Earth. I would love to hear your opinion. Thank you for watching. Bye.